Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Welcome and good evening. My name is Heidi Shoup. I'm president of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to what I have no doubt will be a very fascinating discussion on global rebalancing, politics and markets in a world of transition. Our discussant tonight is Steve Clemons, who will introduce our speaker, but let me just introduce Steve Clemons very briefly. He is the founder and now senior fellow of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation and publisher of the very popular blog, The Washington Note. He frequently writes on topics of international economic policy, defense, and foreign policy, and is a former senior policy advisor to Senator Bingaman and was the first executive director of the Nixon Center. He was recently appointed editor-at-large of The Atlantic and editor-in-chief of The Atlantic Live, the magazine's live events publication. Please join me in welcoming Steve Clemons.
Thank you very much. It is great to be with you again. Thank you so much. The man to my left is a very interesting gentleman. He dresses well. Ian Bremmer is someone, I want to stay away from this script as much as possible. All I'll say is he's president and founder of the Eurasia Group. Ian is a kind of character that if you watch James Bond movies and you would see that evil guy who organized around him the most brilliant and ruthless thugs in the world. Ian is the good version of that guy. Ian is the kind of character who goes around and spends time and interacts with what I consider to be the smartest array of people with whom I've ever worked. We work together. Ian chairs the Council on Geopolitical Risk for the World Economic Forum, and which is not in his bio. And he has used this position in the World Economic Forum, and I guess we're meeting in Abu Dhabi soon and others, to bring people from Russia, from China, from Oxford Analytic together, from Europe, and ask this council to begin thinking through what are the big black swans out there? What are the things that we don't see coming? What, challenging us to get out of our ingrained biases and to sort of think creatively. Ian is a scholar, someone who came out of the academic profession and said, I've got a lot of smart ideas, I've got good networks, why not roll the dice and take some of these skills that he has that are so obvious into business and consulting and risk analysis, and he's done a superb job and built an enormously significant and important and highly respected company. So I meant the James Bond reference because you did sort of look, kind of cool and like you're ready for Monaco or something, Monte Carlo. But anyway, I think that he is extraordinary for us. He wrote a book this past year called The End of the Free Market, which really gets in and tries to distill what are the big factors in the clear competition between where the United States is going and the emergence of China. And I think a very clear different methodology in how China is running and operating its company, and the emergence of state capital and capitalism is really the newest feature in international global finance. So he's an ideas entrepreneur out there with the big ideas that matter, and he hangs out with all the cool people. So please help me welcome Ian Bremmer. He'll get me back. I normally don't dress like this. I'm really sweating. The jacket may come off in a while, and I don't know if any of this is appropriate for TV, but good to be with all of you. We're getting excited to have a discussion. Ian, I think the way I'd like to start out, if I may, you can add any intro comments you'd like, but just to start off and have some fun, what have you been most wrong on in your storied career?
Wow, my story, that's interesting. That's a good way to start. Before I say that, let me thank Steve for being here. Steve's completely biased, by the way, in terms of that introduction. We're good friends, as I think is probably evident. I've known him for a long time. I've read his blog for a long time. I've read his writings for a long time. Anyone inside the Beltway understands you have to listen to Steve, whether, sort of you agree with everything he says or not. He's sometimes can be a little polemic, but he always is provocative and he makes you think, and I love that. I'm really glad he's here. So thank you, Steve. I got to pick anyone to be on this council for geopolitics globally, and I didn't want to run it unless Steve was want to be one of the guys on it. So it was nice. What have I been most wrong about? The thing that always well, actually, I'll tell you. Very recently, I don't know if I was most wrong about it. I was wrong about it. I was really surprised that we were just talking about Thailand with one of our colleagues in the audience here before, and I was really surprised that Shinawatra Yingluck Shinawatra won as definitively as she did. I was in Jakarta 2-3 weeks before the election, and I had some time with Abbasid, and it was clear that they were feeling confident, that they had the generals with them, that they thought they'd get everything done. I thought it was going to be tight. But I didn't think she was going to win big. And if she did win big, it wasn't clear to me they were going to let her win big. And they let her win big. And now they're in tough shape. And they're in so tough shape that I don't know what they're going to do when she eventually tries to change the old ruling to get Thaksin back, which is going to be massively problematic for all of those who have worked so hard to ensure that he stays the hell out of the country. I'll tell you something that historically we got wrong, which was that I certainly was on the side of, which was before which our clients lost a lot of money on, which is because this one, no one lost money on this one. When we were going into the war in Iraq, I was completely convinced that Erdogan, then a new political figure on the stage with a new parliament with the AK party, was going to allow the United States to use Turkish bases. Completely convinced. And we had spoken, we knew a lot of the people around him. We had sort of done a preliminary vote of, sort of who was there in terms of parliamentary votes, and they didn't get it. They didn't get it. And the reason they didn't get it is not because we got the strategy wrong. It was because literally so many of these parliamentarians were so new and had never been in office before, they didn't actually understand basic rules of what did and didn't count as an absentee vote and the rest. But anyway, that was the case. And those markets were down something like 7% on that news. They got creamed. And clients that went the other direction on that, and there were some. Our lead Turkey analyst at the point, almost destroyed his credibility in the field. And it took a while for him to get back for anyone to listen to him. He did. He worked at it.
But very few people thought that they would refuse the bases. So it was a big shock across the board. Right?
But we were convinced. We were loud. We were strong. We were there. We told our clients. They pushed us hard in it. There was money at stake, and we got it wrong. And those are the things. I read Bruce Bueno de Mesquita stuff, and Bueno de Mesquita gets like 90. He always says he gets like 98% of his predictions right, but he predicts a lot of banal stuff, right? It's very easy to predict that the debt limit is not going to blow up. And does anyone really think that we're going to default? And I know the media talks about it, but it's not a real call. It's not. Well, if one person thinks so, okay, but 99 don't. So I'll bet against you. Let me help me, because I don't have kids yet, but I might. And at that point, I'll need to put them to school. And but that's if you make a lot of banal calls, you're not predicting very much. And so I think the ones where there really is a difference of opinion and people are really scared to put the big decision down, whether it's a policy decision or whether it's an investment decision or whether it's a hedge fund. And I will say that one of the things that when I set up Eurasia Group, one of the things I tried to do very carefully was figure out what mechanisms I could use to ensure that analysts wouldn't be biased, that analysts would actually be forced to say what they really thought. And one of the things we did was we went after hedge fund clients early, because hedge funds have no long-term perspective at all. They only care about stuff that's going to happen very, very soon. And if you're an analyst, you're a lot more honest if you find out if you're right or not tomorrow. If you're talking to a government division you don't know for 5 years, or ExxonMobil you don't know for 10, who remembers? And you're going to shade it. It's critical that you get away from that sort of stuff, especially in the field where most people that study Russia are from Russia. Most people that work on China are either pro-mainland or Taiwan or Hong Kong, and those people are worse than useless for us. They're actively pernicious to our model. So you have to work against that.
So about a week and a half ago, I was in Provence. I sat next to Jean-Claude Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank. He's on his way out in October, probably going to write a book, get big speaker fees, move on to his next phase. I tried really hard to get him to talk about the euro. He wanted to talk about the modern staging of La Traviata, which he liked, and why Le Monde was wrong in its review. But I couldn't get much out of him. What do you think, we've talked a lot about the Eurozone, what matters, what doesn't, whether every bank and financial institution will essentially be socialized and guaranteed eventually to the point where then the central bank doesn't really play a function anymore. But tell us a little bit, you don't think the debt limit is going to go under here, but what about the Eurozone?
Well, one of the reasons that I'm more bullish on the dollar medium term is because the euro is in such trouble. I don't think the Eurozone is going to fragment. I certainly think that there's going to be continued crises. So I was in Helsinki 2-3 weeks ago at the European Business Leaders Conference. All these CEOs do it once every 2 years, and it was a fantastic conference. And I had some private time with Olli Rehn, the European Monetary Commissioner. And I started with him, and I said 3 things. And I was not kissing up. I believe all 3 of these things. I may have been kissing up a bit, but I believe all 3 of these things. Number 1, I said I believe that he has the hardest job, the most challenging job of any senior policymaker in a developed country. Number 1. Number 2, I believe that he is doing about the best job I could possibly imagine given his circumstances. And number 3, it is not at all clear to me that that's enough. What am I getting wrong? I asked him. He didn't suggest I was getting much wrong. I think that the best that they can do is continue to muddle through, which would be okay if it wasn't being done with the full blare of the Klieg lights and the markets watching every moment and being prepared to jump, and the credit ratings agencies doing the same. So I think that at the very least, you're going to continue to have crises in the periphery. You're going to certainly have more crises in Greece. And that's going to be very difficult to have a workout that's going to be, sort of constructive and easily organized. Now, I don't believe there's going to be a liquidity event because the money's there. I think that there's going to be a political crisis because the ability to get all these countries lined up quickly when the markets are squeezing them just isn't there. Different electoral processes, different types of actors, different willingness to tolerate moral hazard, all of that sort of thing. In the United States, the reason I'm not worried about a debt limit crisis is because if you play chicken, if you're against a homicidal killer, you don't get in the car, right? But if you're against someone and you know that person is not going to crash against you, then you drive for a very long time, but ultimately you don't crash. The problem is you never notice in game theory, you never play chicken with more than 2 people. It's messy. And the Europeans are playing chicken with lots of people.
Right.
And they don't know. I mean, they all know that they're all committed to the euro, and they're all committed to bailing each other out, but how do you decide what the ordering principle is? And the answer is you don't. Now, here's what I think is the interesting question, because we all know that there are a lot of people out there that are committed to the euro. We've seen all these CEOs in Europe that have written these letters saying that, it's definitive that we have to have the euro. It's really important to us. You've seen European, sort of state leaders saying that they're committed to it. You've had, of course, the IMF and the ECB and all the rest. But, there's one group out there that, in my view, is more committed to a strong euro than anyone else in the world, and that's China. Mm-hmm. Because China desperately needs an alternative to hedge against their dollar exposure. And so here's the question, is when the euro gets in trouble, when the Europeans really have the crisis that pushes them, what do the Chinese do? And what do they ask for in return? What is the conditionality of China with Germany? That's what I really want to know. I think that's really important. I think it's very important. I think anyone that believes the Chinese won't be there when things get ugly, they're absolutely wrong. They will be there. But it could be life-changing, right? Could be NATO changing.
I mean, these are huge geostrategic, systemic issues at play.
Sure.
And another element of it, as I see it, when you look at the mess in Europe, and you look at Germany, which is major surplus country, export monster, consumption is, in my view, not where it should be. You look at China and how it's organized itself and the deals that it's doing, not only in Europe and what will likely be there, but all around the rest of the world. And it's not, and it, in my view, continues to based on what I read in your book, dwarf and hold down consumption, pump out, continue exports, and basically try to do trade and debt deals with the rest of the world so that they buy Chinese products. Where does the demand for U.S. products and the U.S. economy come from? I mean, you've seen deleveraging continue in the United States. Europe is obviously not going to be a growth engine that will, where does demand come from in our side?
For Chinese products, you mean?
Well, yeah, well, no, for the U.S. economy. Where's demand come to buy, to help? I mean,
Where
I'm
does
trying to
US
draw
consumption
this in.
come from, do you
You've
mean?
addressed Europe,
Yeah.
you've got China there
Right.
with a, part of it is, and when we look at the U.S. economy, because inevitably this is the ecosystem in which we're operating, what's very scary is there's no mechanisms that I see out there right now to basically figure out how do we use the rest of the world to jolt us out of the stagnancy we're in.
That
Yeah.
is an issue. I mean, if you're looking at the U.S. recovery right now, and it's looking pretty stagnant, pretty anemic, though a lot of productivity and efficiency
Right.
numbers for multinationals based in the U.S. looks okay, actually, because they've taken their roles down and they're not building them back up. What I'm basically suggesting is you look at Japan. Japan's doing poorly. You look at Europe. Europe's doing really poorly. And you look at the Chinese, and they're hedging and diversifying away from the U.S. to
Right.
the extent that they can. That may bode well for fast-moving U.S. multinational corporations and their productivity and profit line because they're effectively global. I mean, look, the Japanese economy can go down and the Nikkei can do okay because a lot of it doesn't always, but because a lot of Japanese corporations are functionally not really attached to Japan anymore. I mean, Toyota doesn't, I mean, they have its nominal headquarters in Japan, but they don't do anything there. It is a completely an outside of Japan company, and a lot of U.S. corporations will increasingly look like that. And of course, the U.S. is an economy that the demographics in the U.S. are good. And so, I mean, just immigration and birth rates in the U.S. does actually create some stimulus. And American R&D, of course, is still in expenditure terms vastly greater than anyone else. So of the next big things that will come that will spur the global economy, more of them will be in the U.S. than anywhere else. You can make that bet. But how good of a bet is that? How comfortable do you feel making that bet in the context of all this other stuff that you're talking about, Steve? Less comfortable than you used to. Now, the only thing I can say to make you feel better is that in the context of other stuff out there, and I don't just mean the U.S. and Europe and Japan, everyone. So the mantra for the last 3 months has been kicking the can down the road. How many times have we heard that? On how many cable news shows have we heard kicking the can down the road? The Americans on debt and deficit kicking the can down the road. The Japanese doing the same thing with their reform process as they did before the earthquake, kicking the can down the road. The Europeans kick. All true. But no one is kicking the can as far or as hard, and no one has as big of a can as the Chinese.
Right.
Because they can't keep doing what they're doing. And they know it. I don't need to say that. They know it.
So what is the deal between Germany and China potentially look like, and why does it matter to us?
Well, I thought it was interesting that the Germans are now thinking about supplying a whole bunch of tanks, advanced tanks, to the Saudis, which they were never thinking about doing before. They see the ability to diversify with lots of folks. We just had Chinese leadership. I say that because, this, of course, was a relationship that purely was the U.S. before. We just had Chinese leadership go to Europe, and in Britain, there were a couple of little deals done, and Cameron duly chastised them about human rights. And by the way, let's give Hillary Clinton some props on this. Hillary Clinton came out and said, she was asked to talk about human rights. She said, I'm not so sure it's smart to be criticizing your banker. Now, not many people have the gumption to speak that truth in the United States. Not an election year. Well, it's not going to play very well. Well, I'm glad she did it. And I'm glad that Geithner and others have been trying to keep Congress from doing stupid on things like currency, because it will hurt us. It may hurt them more, but it's going to hurt us. We don't need that. We don't need that, not with our economic condition right now. So Cameron sticks with the program, and he talks about human rights in China, and the Chinese don't just scold him. I mean, they slap him halfway across the room, and they say, you know what, you guys aren't very relevant anymore. We're not doing the kind of deals we used to. You're kind of a second-rate power. You really want to hear that from China, from the world's second largest economy? When they then go to Germany and they do 10 times as much in economic deals, and they're going to bring high-tech German manufacturing automotive right into China and do big JVs, and they're going to do climate change and green technology together and all the rest. I'm not suggesting that Germany is not potentially selling their soul and they're going to regret it down the road the way many American corporations have. I'm not suggesting that. But what I'm suggesting is that the Germans are in a great position to hedge. They're in a better position to hedge than anyone in the world right now.
It's good to be a surplus country.
It's very good to be a surplus country.
I don't know how many students are here, but if you did an interesting short-term project for school, you should go look and when I was in Berlin 10 days ago, Wen Jiabao was there, And the last time I was in China, Angela Merkel was there. And I bet if you looked at the frequency and ferocity of the exchanges and heads of state, it would dwarf anything like what's happening in the United States. I mean, if you live in Beijing, as I did for 3 months last year, you can just feel, I mean, in and out, finance ministers, foreign ministers, heads of state, chasing China. And you live in Washington, lots of people come through here, but not anything like that pace. I mean, China's changing the world. The gravity is changing. You can sort of feel it, and that's what your book was about. And you're saying in your last book, which I found so, Ian was nice enough to do the Release Student to America, or at least an event, fantastic program. But you ended sort of oddly. You said this competition really matters. It's going to be, one system versus another, but ultimately their system will lose. But
Yes.
But you said the consequences and the takeaways, and that you thought in the end America would be standing, but it was a very bleak read of the American system.
Well, it's funny. I do a lot of writing with Nouriel Roubini, Dr. Doom, and everybody says that he's always Mr. Sort of the glass is half empty. See, I don't believe the glass is half empty. I think the glass is about 20% or 10% full, but I'm enormously, but I'm really happy that there's any water in the glass at all. I mean, and I think we should appreciate it. I look at the glass, and I'm like, God, there's water in the glass. That's not bad. I'm just an upbeat guy. But so it's a bit bleak from that perspective. But I think that when we think about, look, state capitalism doesn't work. It doesn't work long term. We know that. We know it because people run out of cheap stuff. You run out of cheap oil and cheap resources. If you're, Venezuela or Saudi down the road, you got to change the system. Now, Saudi has cheap oil for a long, long time, so they don't need to change the system soon. Cheap land, Argentina, you run out eventually. Then you got to change the system. They don't do it. They keep defaulting. China has cheap capital, cheap labor. Mm-hmm. They're not running out of cheap capital or cheap labor soon, but they know they're going to run out. And what they've done, when I say kicking the can down the road, what they've done is they've refused to take money away from the state-owned enterprises. They're not building out consumption the way they need to. It's going to be harder to do that long term, but there are a lot of very vested interests in China that say, no, we're not going to.
But until that happens, they get a premium on power today.
Yes, they do.
I tell people that, in the eyes of the rest of the world, if any of you travel around and talk, that the biggest thing that you see in the world, the reaction you get about America is that if you would just accomplish anything you say you would do, it would help. That there's a real doubt in our ability to accomplish our objectives. We look in their eyes sort of like the General Motors of countries, really well branded, lots of capacity, big and sprawling, but just sort of underperforming. Yeah. And China looks like an internet startup to people.
Looks like
and so it gets
yeah.
a premium on power, looks like. And so I know your job is to look beyond the immediate, but I got to tell you, when you go around the world, everyone is chasing China today, and until its bubble bursts at some point. And then there's the whole consequence of what if it bubbled? What if something does, in fact, cripple China? There's a whole nother set of downside scenarios with that. So are we at an inflection point in history where everything changes? When I look at superpowers, and Ian and I have talked about this before, being a superpower is more mystique than real in some cases. If you look at military capacity, economic capacity, moral leadership, and institutions, United States through the Iraq invasion or whatever, we just have this sense, people have this sense that we're militarily overextended. We've shown limits. And so your allies don't count on you as much and your foes move their agendas. Economically, we managed to export toxic financial products to the rest of the world. So we've lost our ability to beat up China on how to organize an economy. Third, I think there's been a moral impact of things like spying on your own public and Guantanamo and things of that sort that I think have thrown into at least some doubt leadership. You may disagree. And in the fourth, institutions, only really the evolution to the G20, which is really a G2 underneath it all, but has been the only major institutional revision in terms of changing from this 1940s, 50s era, crafted structure. So when you look at all of these issues, I look at it pretty bleakly, and I think that the way for the United States to come back and reinvent its position is in the institutional side. Because if you can figure out how to kind of keep American DNA, leverage your power, leverage your relationships, build a new global social contract, you can actually help drive things in every way, even if we're broke. And I'm wondering how you see that.
Well, if you can.
Yeah.
If you can. And you've got to have people that are like-minded around you. First of all, keep in mind that America's, one thing I can say is very obvious, is that the Europeans and the Japanese, who are the countries out there that are most simpatico to us in terms of how you want to project power, how you want to build institutions, what your values are in economic and political systems and all the rest, they're busy. They're busy, they're distracted. I spent a week in Europe that last trip 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Nobody was talking to me about the U.S. debt limit. No one was talking to me about what was happening in Japan. No one was talking to me about China. They were all talking to me about Europe. It's all-consuming, and it's not going away for years. Years. I mean, if you were to ask me when we could start to see the kind of workout for Europe, when we would stop seeing this as a big fundamental issue, 3 years minimum, probably 5 or more. That's a long time, right? So how are we going to reach out to the Europeans? How are we going to do this? How's it going to work? And so then the question is, well, you said it's
Maybe
really
another out of area war.
that would help.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it hasn't worked on Libya, of course.
Libya, Afghanistan.
Yeah, but I don't buy that, right? I don't think that's going to work. I think that economics at home is driving it. And even Libya, what we saw was the U.S. was the leader of last resort, not the lender, but the leader of last resort. It was leading from behind. It only did it after everyone else said, please do this, right? Libya is it's the exception that proves the rule. Everyone hates Gaddafi, right? The Iranians hate Gaddafi. The Saudis hate Gaddafi. That's actually hard to do,
Yeah.
right? And the GCC, the Arab League, begged us to go in, and the French and the Brits begged us to go in, and after all the teeth gnashing, we finally did it. Now, the question, Partly, not
Yeah.
much,
Yeah.
not much. And now the French this morning said, well, maybe Gaddafi can still live in Libya this morning. I'm sure you're watching that. Because the U.S. isn't going to support troops on the ground.
Libya is important because what if Gaddafi pulls it off and he sticks around, or you get some sort of power arrangement? We never really pull off a real regime change.
Right.
And I'm fascinated that the BRICS countries plus Germany abstained in that vote. Is that the new geopolitical fault line? Brazil, Russia, India, China, Germany abstained in the vote on Libya in the UN. That's whether they didn't vote against us,
No.
but it's an interesting line. Them saying, you Americans and you Europeans go ahead, and if you're going to trip over yourselves, that's fine. We'll be there, but people don't talk about it much.
Yeah.
But BRICS plus Germany, and while Turkey wasn't in the mix, Turkey's essentially wanted to abstain. I mean, it's being all things to all people right now. I mean, Turkey is a very strategically interesting player.
I mean, a lot of people are saying that the BRICS have nothing in common, and of course, on a country-to-country basis, you look at Russia and China; they don't like each other. It's not worked out with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization at all. China and India actually are doing a little bit better than a lot of people think because the trade relations are improving and because the economies are complementary. So I'm not a big subscriber of the whole monsoon thing near term, but there are still big problems, cyber attacks and intellectual property and anti-dumping and border issues and all the rest. There are plenty of reasons, and with Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, we clearly see a very different response towards China in concern about currency, manufacturing, buying soybeans, all this sort of stuff, more nationalist. So the BRICS have lots of reasons to beat each other up. But when you put the G20 together, one thing you almost guaranteed was that the BRICS were going to become more cohesive. Not because they have a desire to put forward an alternative leadership model, they do not, but because they oppose the notion that the leadership model that we have is going to be Western. And so the right thing for them to do was not to veto the resolution. That's a bit, because if you veto it, that actually shows some responsibility.
Yeah.
But instead, complain about it, have the BRICS summit, and then say, we dislike what you're doing. That's maximum flexibility right there. And, that's on the IMF thing with, DSK. The thing that I found most interesting, aside from all the other things, was that, of course, immediately all the Europeans got together. Now, in this case, of course, with Germany, and immediately said, let's support Lagarde, which they wouldn't have done 5 years ago. They would have gone on national lines, but they did because all the emerging markets came out and they said, no, we don't like this. Now, everyone said, well, they can't agree on anyone. Of course they can't agree on anyone. That wasn't the point. The point is they disagree with the notion that it should be a European. That's exactly the right thing for them to do strategically. Now, then the question is, what about Germany? Don't know yet. Germany's in play. So I don't think it's BRICS plus Germany. I think it's BRICS, and I think it's the United States, and Japan's not playing, and the Europeans aren't playing, but Germany might, and that's important.
It's really interesting running in. I ran into Carstens, who was the rival candidate in the Frankfurt airport. He was just coming back from India and then coming over to give a speech at I think it was the CSIS of all places, and coming in. And I was sitting next to him in the airport. We were on the same flight. And Christine Lagarde's picture just kept showing up. There was no Carson's picture. It was very uncomfortable. But that's, that's the way these things work. So,
He is not a photogenic man.
He's not a photogenic man. In any case, I do want to open it up. Please join us up here, and then I'll tell you whether your question's any good or not.
Oh, thank you. Let me say first, I've got that sport coat. It looks terrible on me. It looks great on you. I keep hearing in the news, reading the Economist, and I hear the term, the international investors are. They're worried, they're cautious, they're this, they're that. Now, of course, we know about the Sovereign Bank of China, but nobody ever mentions the name of these international investors. And I would like to know who they are. I would like to go knock on their door and say hi. And who are they that we all owe all this money to?
Who are they?
That we owe all of this money to?
Yeah, everybody owes all this. Greece owes them money. Spain owes them money. They carry our debt. Who are they?
Who is they?
Is that a good
It's not
question?
who is we.
Is that a good question?
Yeah, that's.
I'll reserve judgment until you answer. It depends on how you answer. There are
No, I'll
lots
tell
of
you how
opportunities there.
I want to answer that question, which
Yeah.
is not because we know, like for example, the United States, I mean, is a major debtor nation, and we know that the Chinese and the Japanese hold a lot of the money. We know that in Greece you've got Deutsche Bank and the big Spanish banks and other big French banks and others that are very interlinked with that, and that's a real problem, which is why they're all standing together. And of course, the Germans themselves and the sovereigns also have it. But I think what's more interesting than that is the fact that we do reify the markets.
Right.
And we reify the markets because the markets have a herd mentality. And so you want to have a sense. I mean, I think it's always very funny when, oil goes up $2 and you watch in CNBC and people are telling you why oil's gone up $2. And they've got 15,000 different theories and nobody has any idea aside from the fact that the markets have decided that they've gone $2. But once it's gone to 50 cents and a dollar, it's going to move. There's often a lot of swing value in that. And, one of the things that we do, we've got a lot of clients. It's very interesting to me so Peru, this was a good example, something we got really right. We were out there, no one else on the street was out there saying Humala was going to do better than expected. In fact, Humala is going to win. Humala, the guy that people thought was just like Chavez and everything else, everyone we talked to on the street, every single investor, there was a consensus, Humala's not going to win. Okay? Now, even though our view was that if Humala wins, it's not going to be as bad as the markets think, because no one in the markets believed Humala was going to win, and Humala winning was negative, that guaranteed you that the investors, were going to run in the other direction if it hit. So the markets, in a sense, what you're looking for is not what the markets think. What you're looking for is there a consensus view on something, on an outcome, on something specific? And that can change all the time. Do you believe a debt limit is going to get done or not? Even though 99.9% we're not going to have a debt limit problem because there was churn out there and people weren't prepared to take positions. Suddenly, when Obama makes a speech and you've got the gang of 6/5 that are actually coming out with something, the markets are going to go boom, couple points, right? Not bad. Who are these people? Doesn't matter who they are. What matters is that there's a herd mentality when you have a consensus and you go with it or you go against it. I think that's
Pretty
what's
good
interesting.
answer. Pretty good answer.
Not bad.
John McLaughlin's style the answer is there is no they that you're looking for. There is no they. There is no easy answer to this because it's largely governments and large multinationals that place debt, that have assets. It's a very confused picture. It's why during the financial crisis, when none of us knew what a CDS was, or at least I didn't, you get in credit default swaps and you looked at the amount of leverage that relatively minor players, given their asset base, could get out and generate in the economy, in the economy, and how this wasn't really it's a remarkable area. I mean, incredible financial innovation, which I largely support. But to some degree, when you're out there with all of that superstructure out there trying to, it's like a rainforest with incredible diversity of richness in there that the average kind of regulator had no idea to understand. But when you're thinking about the Chinese and the Chinese debt, I'll tell you what they think is the average guy on the street in China thinks that they are the ones who own that debt, because if you're Blackstone Group or you get others out there and you fail to perform with the assets of the sovereign wealth fund in China, the Chinese public gets angry. So I can tell you at least the Chinese public, which is a communist country, nonetheless has people who think that they own, that they're the ones that we owe. So that's the best I can do, and I think that's a pretty good answer too.
Okay,
How about
thank
another? Yes, sir, gentleman, right here.
There's a professor Italian professor, Carlo Pelanda, that talks about very similar things, what you talk about, grand...
He's a
big-
copycat.
Pardon? Well, his book was published 2007. I don't know who's a copycat, but there's a lot of a lot of comparisons. Well, basically, what he
You're from
says.
Slovenia? Is that what you said?
No, he's Italian. He's Italian.
No, you.
Yeah, I'm Slovenian. Yeah. Be aware.
Okay.
No, what he says is that America is not getting smaller, but the world is getting bigger. And in order, so today we have this big fight for global governance. On one side, democratic capitalism, and on the other side, autocratic capitalism. So in order that the democratic capitalism would become or remain the global governor, there is a need to establish a grand alliance between the United States, European Union, and Russia.
And Russia.
So I would like to hear your comments on that. And another question, the biggest challenge to this theory is American pragmatism. America always acted pragmatic through history. So is it possible that America will shift from the transatlantic relations to trans-Pacific relations and shift the geopolitical power from the North Atlantic to Pacific?
Now, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, so one is, is Mahbubani right?
Yeah.
It does sound like Mahbubani who
Yeah,
published
I
his
was-
book way before 2007.
Yeah.
This is Kishore
And with a little
Mahbubani,
Fareed as well.
And Fareed, well,
Thrown in.
Fareed Zakaria came after Mahbubani.
Right.
This is Kishore Mahbubani is from Singapore and one of the sort of closest advisors to Lee Kuan Yew, who sort of launched the Asian values debate for those. He'd be a great speaker here someday. So I just want to say the Italian may have been influenced. We'll just call it that. Not plagiarism, but influence.
We
But
build. We
yes,
all
yes.
build
On others'
on
ideas.
others. We stand on the shoulders of giants.
I
That's
quote
right.
Ian Bremmer all the time.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and I get that from someplace. So I think the issue of which way the U.S. turns is important. And of course, first of all, interesting that he just completely discounts Japan. As someone writing from Europe, that's not
Right.
surprising, but it's unfortunate. The Japanese don't help themselves on that. But if you wanted to have a group together in that regard, the Japanese are kind of stuck. And they do have this, extraordinary defense relationship with the United States. They do have this massive cultural enmity with the Chinese. I think that's relevant. So, but the Russia piece is interesting, of course, because the Russians, aside from having intrinsic racism towards China in a very big way, and have massive concerns on the demographic front, but also, of course, want to diversify on the energy side and really are going to become much more, especially with the Germans not doing nuclear, the Russians are going to be providing gas all day long on the downstream to the Europeans. Mm-hmm. But the Russians hedge more. I mean, you want to talk about pragmatic. I'm amazed that an Italian would call the Americans pragmatic and not the Russians. Because with Russian policy, all you do is follow the money. That's all you have to ever do. Ever, ever, ever. I mean, with America, you do have some pragmatism, but you also occasionally have, sort of this level of evangelism and
Ideological
ideology,
flamboyance, yeah.
exceptionalism, which is going away, in my view, and probably needs to.
Not fast enough.
Don't know. We probably disagree on that. It's the one thing
Yes.
so far, because I think
That's why you keep me on the council. You need to be
I
balanced
do. I need to be
yeah.
balanced. But do I think? So So here's an interesting question, and it's the Beltway thing. So you're going to have a good view on this. When Gates came out and said the other day, basically gave the diatribe in Europe against on NATO, and he was saying the Europeans need to pay more money, right? Now look, we've heard that before, but saying that the Europeans need to pay more money in this environment, come on, right? I mean, the Europeans are going to spend more on defense. That's obviously not credible. And Gates isn't stupid, so why is he doing that? Well, one reason he might be doing it is because he knows that in an environment where defense spending is going to get cut in the United States, he wants to make sure it's coming out of Europe and not Asia. Now, that's interesting, if that's true. I have no idea. What do you think about that, by the way? Your view?
I don't know if I mean, Gates is not dumb. I think he's very angry about Libya and, Afghanistan. Afghanistan been brewing the view that there, but that wasn't new. The new issue was that to some degree the Pentagon and Gates felt dragged into the Libya conflict that they didn't want to be involved
Right.
in.
Yep.
That this was a demonstration project for Sarkozy. And we go in and provided some capacity, and as soon as we get in there, the French want out. They want to basically do it. And then if you go into, you can put together a whole formation of how you sort of think about the American leadership, whether we led, didn't lead, what we did in providing intelligence and capacity, maybe a drone or two. But then you get into NATO, and I've been I was at one of the International Security Forum in Zurich, and these people who've been part of the kind of NATO cluster, friends of the United States who've been this sort of international security crowd that have worked together, literally yelling at me, not me because of me, but because I was representing America on a panel, for our forfeiting our leadership in NATO, that there could be no NATO and no NATO action without American leadership. And so I think Gates did, as a parting shot, just say, I did think he felt that it's not just them taking things out of Europe and how are you going to do the shift. I think he's saying, you guys are free riding.
Yeah, well, sure.
And so building the free riding culture, and that you're continuing a free riding culture, and you're sticking your heads in the sand if you think that these areas, out of areas around your border, are going to be just solved as you decrease your commitment. So it's not just fundamentally a function of budgets and money. It is the question of whether you are becoming inward looking and whatnot and leaving the rest of the world. And I think that, so I do think that he was giving kind of a Scowcroftian realist swat.
Because if that's true, it shows a complete lack of sensitivity to what's been going on inside Europe on the part of Gates. So,
Right.
I mean, but you've got the tactical piece and I've got the strategic piece, and it's interesting to see where they balance out. Otherwise, on the rest of that question, so I think that Russia, there is a good shot that over time Russia will actually start tacking more to the West, and in part that's just because of insecurity and external focus, which the Chinese have none of, but the Russians have a lot of it. And I mean, that's why they continue to have elections and play this game between Medvedev and Putin, even though it's already been decided, because they need to show. It's why they allow Khodorkovsky to actually continue to talk to lawyers and pretend they're having a trial. If China, you'd never hear of Khodorkovsky again, right? Right? Never. And in Russia, they keep trotting him out because they want to show, see? We know he's going back to jail, but see?
Russian democracy, our prisoners can talk to the press.
Our prisoners can talk to the press. So generally, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that's going to happen. My thesis, at least for the near to medium term, next few years, is that we don't have a G20, we don't have a G3, or a G4. We don't have a G2 between the U.S. and China, although Bergsten would like it. We have a G0. We have a G0. We have an absence of leadership. We have an absence of governance.
That's the thing you should tweet. That's the most interesting comment tonight so far.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a, we don't.
Anybody tweeting this?
Live tweeting. There you go.
No? Charles? No?
No, I don't care. It's fine. I'll tweet myself. I'll just tweet it.
Charles publishes the American
RT.
interest. You should get in the tweeting. Yeah. You want to ask a question, Charles? Come on up.
What about talking about debt and fiscal matters in Europe and the United States?
Debt and fiscal matters, Europe and the United States. We agreed to only do this if we were going to have fun.
Yeah.
Debt and fiscal matters, Europe and the United States. Fun?
It's not fun.
Yeah.
No.
It was mentioned on the program in the write-up.
Was it?
Josh Silva at it again. So debt and fiscal matters. Well, he already said that he doesn't believe the debt ceiling will blow up.
I don't. But going beyond that, do I think we, sort of what the Americans are doing now is and what this sort of deal, and I haven't seen the news in the last 6 hours, but as of this morning, what it seemed that they were doing was setting out the parameters for not a deal that can get done before the debt ceiling issue, but one for where money is going to be taken off and what the increased revenues are going to look like. And it's going to take longer than the credit ratings agencies have been demanding before downgrading. Everyone on my firm that's been talking to S&P and talking to clients talking to S&P are saying the downgrade is coming anyway in the next few months. Right. Will they back off? Will this be enough? I don't know. Does a downgrade really matter in the context of everything happening with the Europeans right now? Probably not. Probably not. But, I mean, look, when I really want to talk about debt and fiscal matters, we should talk about culture. Because the Japanese own all of their debt. And if they need to take special methods, whether that is cutting way back on what they can and can't buy, or cutting way back on their energy usage. I was in Tokyo after the earthquake, and I mean, energy usage was way down. It was all voluntary. Why? Because the Japanese have a culture of shame. The United States has a culture of shamelessness. It's different. It's different. The Brits can do austerity. They can do austerity because in Britain it's okay to be number 2 as long as you work really, really hard. It's not okay in the United States. We have to have stuff we can't afford. It's very important to us. Let me bring this back to my previous comment. When China became the world's second largest economy from Japan, we paid attention to it. The Japanese didn't really care. It's not the game they're playing. The United States, China starts getting close, even though they have nowhere near the influence, and they have nowhere near the capacity, and they have nowhere near the per capita wealth, which does matter. And we're going nuts. We're gonna go nuts. We're not gonna be happy about this. It's not gonna be easy. It's gonna be conflictual. And that worries me. Because it's hard to change a culture. We can get some of this stuff right on debt. We can get it. But can we get some of this stuff right in terms of how we think about what is rightfully ours as Americans? Oh, I don't think we can. Not for a long time. And that's the part that probably worries me the most.
Yeah, you've got expectations built in here. What I find interesting is if you think before the financial crisis, I would tell people I sort of felt, I'm really into sort of Kaizen. Does anybody know Kaizen? I try to apply this to a think tank. It doesn't work too well. Kaizen is continuous incremental improvement to perfection, and it's a sort of Japanese management technique. Toyota just-in-time production, and I sort of felt like in America we had just-in-time jobs, just-in-time money. There was so much confidence. There was too much confidence that the average worker had in our economy, and so they borrowed a lot. And it's just like Ian said, they want what they couldn't get, but we were actually shoveling credit out of them. We've now had a heart attack, and now there's great fear in the system. You don't have just-in-time jobs. You're desperate to hold on to what you have, and you've had a big swing. Now you may get a swing back, but when you look at deleveraging and what's going on in the U.S. economy right now, it's very interesting. So when you look at the forward, we're not producing enough jobs. We're not going to produce enough jobs. So you're going to have a very different country grasping for very different things. China is 100th in per capita in the world. It's a poor country with lots of problems, but they've got a lot of swagger right now. It's fragile swagger, but they've got swagger. And it is an interesting problem geopolitically. Now, what I worry about, to come to the debt and finance issues, which a lot of people aren't thinking about, there's a great book by Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff called, what is it, This Hasn't Happened Before, or this has happened before, this hasn't happened before, this has happened before. But it is a distillation of all the economic crises from basically the 17th century on. And you can get
it's a very
interesting.
dense book.
It's a dense book,
but I'm told
nonetheless,
it's
just
fantastic.
read the exec summary in the last few pages and you'll get it. But the interesting thing is 1937. That I wonder if what we're doing in this is that George Soros has come out and say, democracies, when they go through financial crises, end up committing suicide after they survive. That they get through it, and then that democracies hate debt and hate all the things they had to do so much to survive the financial crisis that they often, there's a push, as we had in 1937, which extended the impact of the Depression and took us back down. That I wonder whether this debate, which is happening now, is part of that historical trend that we're reliving. I don't know if it is or not. Maybe there's a lot of other credit buffers out there that will prevent that kind of meltdown from happening again. But I do wonder, after you get a deal and after things set in, there's a lot of near-term cuts, whether you're going to repeat to some degree some of taking austerity out. And I tell people, the other thing about, what do you think about the cost of wars? I don't know where you are. I haven't talked to you about Afghanistan. Do you like wars?
Do I like wars?
Yeah, do you like wars? Do you think they're good, bad for us? I mean, we've spent, I just want to, some people are really into war. Go to AEI. Anybody from AEI? Lots of folks into wars there. They like wars. But if you look at the amount that the U.S. government is spending just in defense, so we're not talking Homeland Security and all, everybody has gotten into sort of terrorism watching, but just the DOD budget, and you take the level in 2000, so before 9/11, and you just account for inflation over time and what it would be, the amount we've spent just in DOD above what would be normal, as you considered in 2000 when we sort of felt safe, I think we felt safe, is $2.3 trillion. $2.3 trillion in the private sector, cumulatively, would sustain 7 million jobs. And so, as a certain point, I'd like to ask this, is there a guns versus butter trade-off today?
Sure. With
the wars, with our insecurity as a people? We spend more money than every other government in the world on defense and security, yet we don't really feel like a safe nation. And now you're seeing McKinsey just came out and said by 2020, if we don't, we need to produce 21 million jobs. So At least I know there are 7 million jobs tied up in there.
Well, I guess I'd have to hedge a little bit because, I mean, you're implying that $2 trillion of cost doesn't have any benefit for the U.S. economy, and of course
I
we
didn't say not any benefit.
No, but you didn't
the
talk about the
multiplier is low.
benefit. Oh, I from an R&D perspective, and in terms of what then comes out into the civilian economy, I've heard different people talk in very different ways about that, and I don't.
DC is the only place where housing went up, so
That's
it did benefit.
that directly, yes, but I'm thinking about spillover for innovation and how you actually drive innovation in the state sector and the private sector working together. It happens in universities and they get funded, and I don't think we have a good sense in how much is developed by that. Now, is that the way we should be thinking about spending on military wars? Probably not, but it's probably the reason why we need DARPA. And I like DARPA as an institution. I think we should do more of that sort of thing. And they do lots of stuff that has military applications, has
DARPA,
all sorts of
Defense
applications.
Advanced Research Projects
And
Agency.
IARPA as well, and all of those.
There's
I think those
EARPA
are.
also, right?
There's EARPA? I
Yeah,
know
it's
IARPA.
energy ARPA.
Oh, I didn't know there was an energy. Well, that's
Energy ARPA.
I
I was
think we
with the
should have an
energy
energy
ARPA,
ARPA. We should probably have an advanced infrastructure ARPA. That would probably be a smart thing to do. I mean, seriously, we should have that. We don't. We should. There you go. We should
Okay,
do that.
good.
Yeah.
All right.
But do I think that we're going to have are we going to have a come to Jesus moment about what we're spending it on? The thing that concerns me most about is that in this new normal that El Arian loves to talk about, with all of these unemployed people and all of these people that are thinking about the fact that they're not as optimistic about where the future is, that they're going to start pushing for policies that really end up undermining American competitiveness. They're going to push for protectionism, and they're going to push for closing borders, and they're going to get scared about immigration. They're going to do things that absolutely would cut off not just our nose to spite our face. That worries me even more than Afghanistan, because let's face it, everybody knows there's no more appetite for Afghanistan. Everyone knows there's no more. So that's when you said before you think that we're still doing American exceptionalism. I think that no way. I think that Obama on Afghanistan, he did everything possible to basically say, you know what, this is a legacy Bush issue, and I'm going to give the generals just enough troops to make this still be their issue, because I don't want to take it. And as soon as I can get out, I can get out. And he killed bin Laden in the meantime, and good for him, right? But I don't think that there's in this administration, I don't see a lot of appetite for getting involved in significant wars. Having said that, go to the Middle East, talk to the Gulfies, talk to folks in North Africa, and ask them what they think about the United States. They like Obama, but they believe that the U.S. is a maker and as a taker and not a maker of foreign policy. They believe that the U.S. is increasingly not relevant, and that will have knock-on effects for how they align themselves, and that will matter to us. I'm not suggesting that we need to go throw more troops in at all, but I do believe there's a lack of strategy in the Obama administration on foreign policy because they don't see it as politically useful. They're probably right short term. They're probably wrong long term. It's so funny that while Bush was the one, he said he wanted to run the country like a CEO, it turns out that Obama's actually much more like that.
Interesting. Other questions?
Dr. Bremmer, I'm sure you heard about some of the goings-on happening with the Spratlys, especially in the South China Sea, with the recent news that a member, well, actually it's a coterie of members of the Philippines Parliament, made it actually to one of the islands in the Spratlys, big show with tanks, press conference and all.
Yeah.
The interesting thing to me, just looking at this in a geopolitical context, I can think of a very fast parallel to roughly 4 years ago in the context of the Russians and Georgia, given the fact that the United States is still being stuck in this imperial overstretch. And with this whole matter of political transition happening in 2007 as they did with the Russians and 2012 with the Chinese, still a matter of leadership occurring. I was wondering, how would you assess chances of conflict happening in one of these near neighborhood areas? In the case of Georgia with the Russians,
big-
Spratlys, Russia,
Spratlys.
China, the Philippines.
Big difference.
Yeah, how do you gamble?
Big
lots of-
difference. Big difference. The big difference was that the Russians were attacking Georgia in large part out of insecurity and the feeling that they were getting encroached upon and they were losing territory. You had the Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution, the Tulip Revolution. Europe and the U.S. were talking about NATO enlargement into Ukraine and Georgia.
And Saakashvili was taunting them.
Yes, indeed. And the Russians thought that the CIA and Soros were teaming up to help make this happen, which is a ridiculous concept, but nonetheless, I mean, there was a lot of conspiracy around. They were very insecure. Saakashvili was absolutely taunting
I asked
them.
him
I mean,
a
there's no
question when he
question.
was here in Washington once, and I asked him, I said, NATO is fundamentally a conservative alliance, and you're acting very flamboyantly. And he says, I'm not worried I have lots of American servicemen living in Tbilisi.
Well,
And
and,
so
and,
he
and
would
he
do
had
this, so,
Cheney,
yeah.
and he had other people in the White House. There was a White House split, and some of them were egging him on, and some of them weren't. And Colin Powell was very upset about all that stuff, but Colin Powell was not exactly the most, front-running, strong-minded politician in that group, right? So that's what happened in Georgia. The China, Southeast Asia, East Asia stuff is completely different because the Chinese actually are feeling much stronger. The financial crisis happened, and the Chinese military basically said, this is a slightly new strategic environment, not sure, but let us test American commitment in the region. Let us test commitment of these countries to the United States. So let's just rattle the trees a little bit. Let's shake the cages, and let's see what happens. And that's what they've done. And they've done it with the Japanese, they've done it with the South Koreans, they've done it with the Vietnamese, they've done it with the Philippines, they've done it with Indonesia. And in some cases, like in Vietnam, you saw the Vietnamese acted back in a strong way, including with the United States. Chinese backed off. In other cases, haven't reacted as strongly. Chinese have their own new normal. New normal doesn't just happen geoeconomically, it happens geopolitically too. But so that's what I think is happening there.
This is the fragile swagger issue.
Yeah.
They're moving out. They're testing. The Japanese ship, or the Chinese ship with the Japanese island was a similar case.
Yep.
That wasn't just a test of Japan, it was a test of the United States.
Definitely.
What we would do.
Yep.
The North Korean issues. So you're going to have a lot of these pinpricks. And the Chinese think, and I've spent a lot of time talking to leaders about exactly this issue on the Spratlys, they believe time is on their side. So they want to move out, and they would look at it as a mistake if they weren't basically, as they saw it, asserting territorial claims. But on the other hand, there's another side of China, which is through the ASEAN +3 and others. They're essentially creating working groups and talking. So they play both sides, hard edge and negotiation.
One interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people talk about in the cyber warfare perspective is Russia. I mean, you have a huge hacker community. You have a huge underground, like organized crime that's fostering the, all of this hacking. How do they play, especially with all the other geopolitical, decisions that
Okay, so
Russia has?
I'm not as worried about Russia. I mean, yeah, it's a criminal community, but it's a criminal community that I don't think has an enormous amount of direct support at the highest levels of the Kremlin. I obviously can't prove that, but if you read that piece in Wired about what was going on in one town in Romania, and they were all hackers and they busted apart, I think that was an incredible expose. If you haven't read it, it was about 6 months ago. Read that article. That's exactly the kind of thing that seems to be going on across Russia. And the Russians have a very permissive environment. People make money out of it. That's very different from being strategic and helping the Russians do something strategically. Because strategically, what they're doing is ripping off people that are trying to just take stuff out of the ground in Russia. In China, it's much more strategic. It's aligned with industrial policy. It's aligned with national security policy. I think it's interesting that 90% of the money the Pentagon is planning on spending on cyber is going to be on defensive and not offensive. Very different from the spending on nuclear. Which is offensive and not defensive. Much more stable to spend all your money on offensive, not defensive, right? In terms of other countries, because then you get mutually assured destruction. You spend your money on defensive, it implies that you know a war is coming and you can't stop it. And why are they spending it on defensive? Because they can't prove who's attacking them, right? I mean, when you don't know where it's coming from, you don't go offensive, you go defensive. That should really concern us. That should really worry us.
Ian, thanks so much. Every time I am on a panel with you or in a meeting in World Economic Forum, I feel, so good that I'm not one of the people that has fallen into the Shark Tank. Again, James Bond. But
Yeah.
thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.